All right, I think we're live.
Off and running.
Yeah. Welcome back, everyone, to part two of our three-part series on sleep. So hopefully many of you watched and got something out of the discussion that we had last week.
Yeah.
So you can replay last week's session if you go through and scroll back on the newsfeed to Tuesday of last week. If you've not yet watched it, we really would suggest watching it because you're going to find quite a few gold nuggets in there as to why we sleep and how it impacts our health more broadly. Today, feel free, just like you did last week, to write in comments any questions as we go on, and we'll endeavour to answer them as we go along, and spend a bit of time at the end as well for some Q&A. So today we're going to be focusing more so on the how. So how much sleep you need and how much is recommended for optimal health at different stages of our lives. So in today's session, we're actually going to be covering some answers to a number of questions that our clients commonly ask us here in the clinic about sleep, and some common concerns a lot of people have. So something we get asked a lot is the concern of not being able to fall asleep at night times, why lying in bed and not being able to fall asleep, and why that is. So we're going to cover that today. The concern of waking up really early in the morning and not being able to get back to sleep, well, we're going to cover that as well. And also as well, the concern of waking up regularly during the night for the bathroom, and how to overcome that. So we'll go over those types of things today. So as we go through the next sort of 20, maybe 30 minutes or so, and you learn more about sleep, have a think about some things that you can start doing beginning from tonight.
Yeah, cool. So to kick things off with the new content for today, I'll run you through a little bit about how sleep changes across the lifespan, because obviously we see people of all different ages, and the need for sleep can change a little bit throughout your life. And obviously newborns and youth, it's extremely important for the developing brain, hence why children need 10 or more hours per night worth of sleep. And of course newborns don't get it all in one block. They don't have a normal sort of circadian rhythm, which is something that we're going to explain a little bit later, but that's why their sleep patterns are not quite the same as adults, for example. And as we move through into adolescence and as teenagers, unfortunately, most teenagers are only getting a fraction of the required amount of sleep for healthy brain development, and that's something that we could probably spend a whole session on, but we won't for today. Probably you could say it's been impacted quite heavily by use of smartphones and computers recently, which is another thing that we'll touch on later today. As we move into adulthood, the requirements for sleep don't drastically change over the adult lifespan, but the sleep pattern does, and what kind of sleep we get. Unfortunately, from like your late 20s, we typically get less and less deep non-REM sleep, which is something that we covered what that is last week. And we know that this is important and has a big impact on all areas of health and disease. And as we get older and older, unfortunately, your sleep depth continues to worsen. But that doesn't mean that you can't change some parts of your sleep and optimize it to get the most out of your health benefits, I suppose. The myth that you need less sleep as you age is not really that true. We just tend to not get as much as you get older, unfortunately. So sleep, very important throughout all stages of the life. And even as an older adult, you still need to get good quality sleep for health outcomes.
Yeah, it's a common misconception, isn't it?
Yeah.
That as we get older, we don't need as much. But,
for sure.
Yeah.
Some other important points to note, that some people naturally prefer to sleep later in the night and wake up later, or fall asleep earlier and wake up earlier, which is something we're going to touch on in a second as well. I think there's terms that we can use called like night owls, people that tend to naturally fall asleep a bit later and wake up a bit later. and then larks or falling asleep a little bit earlier, getting up a little bit earlier. Genetically, you're more predisposed to one or the other, with a mix amongst the human population of some early, some late. So we're going to touch on all that in just a second, actually. I'll hand it back over to Dan.
Yeah. So I guess we need to have a delve in relatively deeply to look at what needs to happen for the body to actually fall to sleep. And I guess to start with, we need to know what determines our sleep and wake cycles. So our sleep and wake cycles are regulated pretty tightly by something we call the circadian rhythm, which something is a lot of you have probably heard of before. So the circadian rhythm is kind of like our internal body clock. It's probably the best sort of analogy, we'd say.
Yeah.
In humans, this clock is about 24 hours in duration, which is obviously quite convenient, as it's nearly identical to the rotation of the Earth. It instructs us to feel sleepy at nighttime, and it tells the body, I guess, when to start waking up as the morning approaches as well. The circadian rhythm is regulated mainly by sunlight, but it can also be impacted by our eating habits and even our social habits too. Mm-hmm. And this means that our internal clock, the circadian rhythm, can actually be shifted back or forward depending on our exposure to light, and also in our general sort of lifestyle routines as well. There's a lot of things that we can do to sort of change this. So when we refer to light, it's not just sunlight. It can also be the light that comes from our TV screens, from our iPads and our mobile phones, or even the small amount of light that comes from our bedside lamps, for example. Mm-hmm. So, I thought you were going to say something. Sorry.
No, that's all right.
So the internal clock, the circadian rhythm, it controls the release of melatonin. And we like to refer to melatonin as the hormone of darkness. Many of you may have heard of this before, and some of you actually may take it as a medication to help you to sleep. If you look at sleep as, say, a 100-meter sprint race, melatonin is kind of like the starter's gun. It signals the start of the race. Melatonin it tells the brain to start winding down and preparing you for sleep. If you're sitting on the couch, for example, say an hour after dinner, and you're reading a book and you start to feel a bit drowsy, then it's likely that melatonin's the culprit, rapidly rising in your bloodstream. Mm-hmm. So melatonin starts being released when the sun goes down, and it slowly continues to increase as the evening progresses and goes on. So once you fall asleep, it continues to be released, and over the course of the night, and it stops being released somewhere in the wee hours of the morning, preparing us to soon wake up.
Yeah. I'll show you before you move on.
Absolutely.
I was going to say, you're probably wondering what these squiggly lines back here are. I'm not sure how easily you can see what we've drawn on here, but if you've got some time points down here, so 12 p.m., middle of the day down here, 6 p.m. in the evening, middle of the night, 12 a.m., early morning, 6 a.m., and then back to the middle of the day. So it's a 24-hour stretch, the circadian rhythm, if you will. And this red line down here is the melatonin release. So it's pretty low during the day and during light, but as soon as it gets to, at the moment, about 6 p.m., it's going to skyrocket all the way up and stay elevated over the course of the night until the early morning, where it'll start to drop back down again, and which is in time with most people waking up. There's another hormone here, which is the black line, called cortisol, which basically works on the opposite end of the spectrum to drop down to allow you to go to bed, and then rises in the early morning to wake you up. So a bit of a visual representation of what Dan's just taken you through there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's regulated by sunlight for sure, but also temperature as well.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So usually when the sun starts going down, it's when it starts to cool down outside as well.
Actually, yep.
And it's at that point that we usually start to see the melatonin levels rising. So
yeah.
So it's important to know that our circadian rhythm does change a bit at different times of our lives over, I guess, the lifespan. So for adolescents, for example, their circadian rhythm and their melatonin release patterns occur much later in the day than adults. So this means that they feel sleepy much later, and they can't fall asleep until really quite late, a lot of the time after midnight.
Yeah.
I know in my case, when I was a teenager, I couldn't fall asleep until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, right?
Yeah, pretty common.
And it means as well, because their release pattern of melatonin is later, it means that they can't naturally wake up until later as well. So you've got, alarm clocks going off at 7 a.m. or whatnot, ready to go to school after, maybe having 5 or 6 hours of sleep.
Yeah.
So
not ideal.
No, it's a big topic here, considering what we learned last week about the importance of sleep and learning and memory. And we know that many of our teenage students are sleep deprived due to no fault of their own.
Yeah.
Like Tom said before, it's a topic we probably could spend a whole Facebook Live on, really.
Yeah.
Now, on the other end of the age spectrum, so for older adults, we know that the circadian rhythm and the melatonin release patterns occur much earlier than younger adults. So there's a natural desire for the body to fall asleep earlier, and also to wake up much earlier as well. So hopefully this answers the question, if it's a burning question inside of you right now, why it is that you can't sleep past 5 or 6 a.m. It's just natural physiology, really.
Yeah.
And this is why we recommend that a lot of our clients, head to bed earlier once you start feeling drowsy, rather than staying up, watching Netflix or, YouTube until the early hours of the morning.
Yep. Yeah, something I think a lot of people will get into the habit of. So, I've been guilty of it in the past as well. But the more you know about sleep and how important it is, and hopefully learning a little bit about, the sleep cycles and things like that, it's might be the motivation people need to,
start making
put the laptop away, or and then start making some changes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So there's a bit of content there, but we thought that now that you know a bit of the science behind falling asleep, we thought it might be helpful to share a few things that we do that are science based, really, that you may also find useful, that will help you to fall asleep easier. So we make sure we endeavour to turn off our devices, at least an hour before we go to sleep or before we want to fall asleep.
Yeah.
We try to dim our lights or turn them off altogether in some cases, at least an hour before sleep as well.
Yeah, I feel like I'm spending the whole evening just following my housemate around, turning all the lights off after we just turn them on. It's a bit of a pain, but it works. It works.
My housemates found, I think, a little bit strange that I'm lighting a candle now and have a candle in the bedroom rather than the lights on.
Hey, it's going to be better. It's going to be better for you.
We try to eat as early in the evening as possible, and this is because, like we said before, our eating habits can change our circadian rhythm as well. So if we eat earlier in the day, it means we're going to, more naturally, I guess, fall asleep earlier.
Yeah.
And as well, we try to do relaxing activities at the end of the day as well. So like reading, for example, deep breathing, stretching, meditation, things that are going to start to wind down and relax your body, ready to fall into a slumber, really.
Yeah. One thing a couple of weeks ago I was guilty of on the weekend was playing some video games with friends, sort of until not even that late, but just until sort of 9 p.m. And after doing something like that, that's A, bright lights, and B, requires a lot of attention and focus, I was so sort of, wired and focused on that to try and go straight to sleep was a bit of a mistake, because I was just lying there in bed, just sort of thinking about it. And I think that's a good example, but, you can put, watching TV, scrolling through the internet, reading emails, there's other things that will do the same thing. So not only are you getting the light exposure, but just being anxious about things as well doesn't really help. So that's something that I've tried to cut out altogether as well.
And we talked about that last week, right?
Yeah.
In terms of like the different brainwaves, and what's happening there. So like if you go back and have a look at last week when we were talking about the brainwaves, when you're sort of checking emails and like watching TV and things, your brainwaves are probably going to be more like, these fluttery, waves, as opposed to the deep, slow ones that we want to be inducing, I guess.
Definitely.
For sleep. So
yeah.
Just want to say hi to Nicole and hi to Wendy. anyone else that's out there and has any questions, feel free to write them in as we go.
Yeah. So in addition to the circadian rhythm, there's another system that drives our need for sleep that actually works independent to melatonin, the circadian rhythm, and it involves a complex series of hormonal releases that build up what we call a sleep pressure. So as the day goes on, we have a build-up of a product called adenosine in the brain, and the build-up of this in the brain increases that sleep pressure basically until we go to sleep, which then sort of almost acts as like a release valve for some of that adenosine compound. Even a short nap in the afternoon can sort of release the valve, if you like, on that sleep pressure. And that's why some people might find that, if you have a bit of a snooze in the afternoon, or even falling asleep on the couch and things like that, it might be a little bit harder to then fall asleep in bed later on. And I think the build up and then release of this compound called adenosine can play a big part in that. And I always remember, my mum saying, don't fall asleep on the couch or things like that, because you're going to struggle to get to sleep, and you sort of think, oh yeah, whatever. But it's actually based in human physiology and science that that's a real thing. So I think that's something else that people probably will struggle with is, falling asleep on the couch and then trying to go to bed and fall asleep straight away, and it's unlikely to happen. So,
yeah, and a lot of people sort of as well ask us, sort of report this as a problem quite regularly, but it's normal physiology, and a lot of people sort of say, oh, I've got insomnia. Yeah, it's not insomnia at all, right? It's normal physiology.
Exactly. Yeah, it's going to happen to anyone. If you go to sleep for 2 hours before you get into bed, you're going to struggle to fall asleep in bed. So, and also on top of that, your body then starts to associate falling asleep with being on the couch as opposed to being in bed, which makes it even harder to stay asleep in bed. So that's a whole nother topic as well.
Yeah, it's probably a bit of a takeaway point, I guess, is that, and we'll cover it a lot more next week when we sort of outline a bit of a framework in terms of how to get better sleep. Really, is if you do feel drowsy at nighttime, then don't delay. Yeah, exactly. Go to bed. Yeah, exactly. It's can be a bit pointless sometimes, just sort of doing it that way, but that's okay. One thing that has a really big impact on not only the build-up of that adenosine compound that we just spoke about, but on melatonin, your circadian rhythm as well, is the impact of a substance that I'm sure everyone's aware of called caffeine. So obviously found in lots of different compounds, which we'll talk about in a second, but we try and always recommend to not only clients, but my family, and I'm sure people that Dan knows as well, to try and limit the amount of caffeine or coffees that you get in, especially even after midday. What caffeine can do is it actually competes with the spots where in your brain where adenosine reacts, and it blocks it from attaching, which means it can, lead to less of that build-up of sleep pressure throughout the day and struggle to fall asleep. It takes quite a long time, 5 to 7 hours usually, for the average person to clear half of the amount of caffeine from a coffee, for example, and after 12 hours after drinking that cup of coffee, you're more likely to still have a quarter of that caffeine still in your system. So for example, if you're having an espresso shot at midday, by midnight, when you should be asleep or trying to get to sleep, you're probably still going to have a little bit of that, up to a quarter of that caffeine still floating around in your system, which, some people say I can drink coffee and I get to sleep just fine. And that may be the case. But as we'll learn about in a second, it's not just about falling asleep, it's about staying asleep, and then also the quality of your sleep as well. So something to think about. Caffeine can be found in lots of different products. So even some decaffeinated coffee can have some caffeine there sometimes. Any products that contain cocoa, so chocolates, cakes, biscuits, ice creams, frozen yogurt, cereals, hot chocolate drinks, they've all probably got a little bit of caffeine. Teas can sometimes as well. And then, unfortunately, some medications that people have to take can have caffeine in them as well. So something to think about.
And we're going to touch a lot more on this next week, I think, as well, as part of one of our things to think about when we're trying to get a better night's sleep as well. So,
hopefully that gives a bit of an answer as to why it is that maybe why it is that you're waking up during the middle of the night. Maybe a bit too much caffeine, or just in general, maybe too much fluid in the latter part of the day. Really. So trying to minimize those two things generally, and we will cover it more specifically next week, but in terms of caffeine, we generally recommend none after, ideally no coffee, for example, after midday. We try to make a cut-off rule for that, and try and consume most of your fluids really in the first half or 3/4 of the day, and try and really restrict it towards the end of the day.
And we touched on one of the things that we're trying to provide some information on today was people that have to wake up regularly in the night, and unfortunately it happens more and more as you get older as well, but simply just using the bathroom before you go to bed, not drinking a big cup of tea, coffee, water, whatever it is, right before you go to bed is going to be a good thing to think about as well. Don't be surprised if you have to get up and go to the bathroom in later the night if you've just drunk a huge amount of liquid. So something to think about for everyone that's watching.
Absolutely. So we did talk about earlier as well, we were going to be covering how much sleep that you need for general health and optimal health. So we'll cover a bit of that now, but it's important to consider as well that it's not just duration that we're looking at. So it's not just the number of hours that we're looking at for good sleep. Like Tom's alluded to previously, it's also quality and consistency of sleep that we need to be considering as well. So we'll look at duration to begin with, and we know that anything less than 7 hours of sleep across 10 or more days is technically it's the technical definition of chronic sleep deprivation. So and we know from last week it carries with it many health risks. So please go back and watch last week's Facebook Live to learn a little bit more about those health risks. So we know that the number of people who can survive on 5 hours of sleep or less without any impairment, expressed as a percentage of the population and ran it to a whole number, is 0. It's more probable that you'll be struck by lightning than being able to function at your highest level on 5 hours of sleep a night. And we know that a lot of people, that's how much sleep a lot of people get.
That's just off one night as well. That's just off one night, not back to back to back to back. Just one night of 5 hours sleep, you're guaranteed you're not going to be functioning as well the next day.
Absolutely. And we know as well that, generally, I think a lot of people feel that if they're getting at least 6 hours of sleep per night, and that's pretty good. But, it'll get you through. But it's definitely not going to help with, optimizing your health.
No.
And we know that specifically with 6 hours, so if you're sleeping 6 hours per night for 10 days, it causes the same decrease in cognitive performance as having one day or one night without sleep at all. So, it's
a bit worrying.
It's equivalent to having an all-nighter, right? Now, the thing is that you don't know how sleep deprived you are when you actually are sleep deprived, because your subjective opinion is consistently wrong. You acclimate and you adjust and sort of habituate to this new normal of lower energy, lower concentration, and poor health. So it's something really to consider, I guess, is that, your perception is just warped, really, and you don't know how tired you really are. Perhaps one of, if not the most important takeaway from what we're talking about today, is that you need to try and give yourself at least 8 hours of sleep opportunity. So you can start this every day and make it a non-negotiable. You may not be sleeping for that entire 8 hours, but you definitely can give yourself the best opportunity to be sleeping that much.
And that kind of that can change to day to day. So say you have to be up at 6:30 or something for whatever reason, and that might be earlier than your normal waking time. But in that case, an 8-hour sleep opportunity would be making sure that you're in bed and trying to get the sleep from at the latest 10:30. And like Dan said, you may not fall asleep for that entire time, but give yourself that best chance, and that good opportunity is a good starting point, and something that everyone that's watching can do from tonight, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And these things as well, I mean, we'll probably cover a bit more next week, but, you know, even like acutely, like immediately, our bodies and our brains are refreshed and recover so much better, and we function so much better, even after, you know, starting that process from the very beginning. It's not something that takes like a month or 3 months to start to notice the changes. It happens immediately.
Exactly right. The other thing that, or the two other parts that we sort of have learned quite a bit about recently as well are not only the duration of your sleep, but also the depth or the quality of your sleep. And we touched on this last week, the deep sleep and lighter REM sleep. Unfortunately, even from your late 20s, you're starting to get less and less quality or deeper non-REM sleep. By your 40s, you will have seen up to 60 or 70% drop in the amount of deep sleep you're getting, and by your 70s and up to 80 or 90% drop, which sounds like it's pretty full on, and it is in a way, but it doesn't mean that you still can't do something about it as well, and taking on board a couple of those things that we've spoken about so far. It's also very hard to know the electrical quality of your sleep. No one gets up in the morning and thinks, oh yeah, I definitely had this much deep sleep last night. It's not really possible to know that. And one thing that unfortunately many older adults may not realize is that they're not getting enough deep sleep, which happens naturally, and hence not see the link between poor sleep and good health. Poor health as well. Something else to consider when it comes to sleep depth is, your sleep efficiency. So time in bed divided by time asleep. Essentially, if you're in bed for 8 hours, how much of that time are you sleeping for? And sleep fragmentation as well. So having to wake in the night, and we've touched on this a little bit already, can be a problem for a lot of people, especially as getting older in life. Maybe some things you can do to ask yourself if you are getting enough deeper quality sleep is, if you're waking up in the morning, could you fall back asleep late in the morning at 10 or 11 a.m.? Can you function optimally before midday? And, that's without yawning all morning and without feeling sleepy all morning. And then after these two questions, is this after a full 8 hours of sleep? So you're getting the duration that you need, but you're still tired. Maybe there's another factor that's at play in regards to the quality of your sleep as well. In regards to we know that sort of 8 to 9 hours of duration of total sleep is good, but in regards to the exact amount of deep sleep that each person should be getting, it's going to differ from person to person depending on age. And we don't really have an exact answer for you for the exact amount of time. But generally, I think for most people, the answer is and should be more than you're currently getting as well. So
in probably 95% of cases.
Yes, myself included, I would probably say as well.
And you and I get quite a good amount of sleep, I think, like objectively speaking, in terms of numbers. Yeah. But we can still get more.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. Exactly right. Exactly right. So and then the next thing to think about is your consistency across time as well, across the week. So do you have regular sleep and wake times each night? The body loves routine, as we've seen with the circadian rhythm, and it's arguably the most important factor in getting a good night's sleep across a longer period of time. Think about this. Your body and your brain would like a consistent sort of sleep and wake time. So how can you expect to get a good night's sleep and then function well during the day if you're not sticking to this routine? So for example, if you're sleeping 12 till 8 a.m. one night, then 12 till 5 a.m. you've got to get up early the next day. then you're really tired that day, so you're falling asleep at 9 to 6, it's going to be very, very hard to expect to be able to fall asleep and wake up feeling refreshed if that's constantly changing. So
we're expecting a lot from the body if that's the case.
Exactly right. Yeah. So consistency is something that's really important. I think many experts agree that the exposure to technology and devices are one of the biggest barriers in having a consistent sleep rhythm. And obviously, we're not saying either that you must go to bed at 10 o'clock each night. You know, you're going to have times where you catch up with some friends for dinner or things like that, and obviously that's gonna come into life as well. But trying to be as consistent as possible means that on those 1 off or 2 off nights, it's going to be much easier to fall asleep after that.
For sure. It's going to be much easier to get back in a consistent routine, right? The body just knows what's normal. Yeah,
exactly. And this is sort of all considered, I guess, we call it part of sleep hygiene, which is a term that some of you might have heard of, some might not, and it's something that we're going to cover a lot next week. And it's vital to sleep consistency. And sleep hygiene, sort of essentially, it's the wellness of your sleep, and that's what we're going to spend the majority of next week on. Is some practical things that you can do. Some we've spoken about already, but essentially,
that's sort of bring it all together.
Bring it all together, and essentially, that's from all the feedback we've got. That's what people want to know is, what can I do to get a better night's sleep? And hopefully, you've got some things out of today. And next week, we're gonna tell you all we know about how to do that, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. Now that I guess a bit more of the science and whatnot behind, and the theoretical sort of basis for why it is that we do what we do.
Exactly. Yep.
Now we can actually give you the what's, the specifics of what to do, right?
Yeah.
So we've gone through quite a bit of content there today. We've got a question from Wendy about what we think of the idea of having a daily or even an occasional nap to catch up on sleep. So absolutely. So we'd call this a biphasic sleep pattern. So having like a long nighttime sleep and a shorter sleep in the day.
Yeah.
And absolutely, there's a lot of research to support the beneficial effects of having a biphasic sleep pattern, of having a nap or a short sleep in the daytime.
Yeah.
And definitely a lot of people prefer this. Just generally, it's something we actually recommend and prescribe to a lot of people for energy conservation to start with.
Yeah, yep.
It's something that's really quite rejuvenating.
Yep.
So absolutely, Wendy, that's absolutely okay. And I think it's fair to say that by some segments of the population, it's probably a frowned upon thing to do. Yeah. But it's something we highly recommend. Absolutely.
And in certain cultures, like in over in Europe, for example, the siesta is literally a part of their life and their lifestyle. So obviously, it's something that you can do. I think what we were touching on before is more so, falling asleep at sort of 5, 6, 7 p.m. and then waking up again and expecting to be able to fall asleep straight away. That's where you might come into a bit of trouble. But in the early afternoon, a short nap, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and the research sort of suggests that as well.
Do you have any sort of cutoffs? Because usually, like traditionally, what I've recommended people do is if they're going to have a nap or a sleep in the day, to make sure it's say before 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yeah, I'd sort of recommend the same, I think, and even just from personal experience, when you're you're falling asleep at sort of 4, 5, 6 o'clock, it's then becomes a bit harder to have you stick to your normal bedtime, I suppose.
Because as Tom was mentioning earlier about that sleep pressure, we still want the adenosine and that sleep pressure to have, give it enough time to raise up and rise up to feel the need for sleep later on in the night.
Yeah.
So if we're having, a nap too late, it's going to affect that. Whereas if you do it early in the day, no problem at all.
Yeah.
And in terms of duration as well, we probably don't really have a specific guideline for that, I guess. But, whatever you feel necessary.
Yeah, whatever's going to feel natural, I suppose. And, even for like, power nap is recommended if you're feeling sleepy while you're driving. So obviously there's lots and lots of benefits to it if it's necessary. But I think, not extending it past a couple of hours is probably
reasonable, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we'll wrap it up there. If there's any other sort of questions and things or comments that come up following on from what we've just spoken about there today, feel free to comment or send us a message on the Glenara Health Hub group page, or send us an email or give us a call, or ask us next time you're in the clinic. But until then, we'll catch you here again next Tuesday at 1 o'clock to wrap up the 3-part series on sleep.
Yep. Thanks for joining, guys, and hope you enjoyed the content for today. So see you next week, I suppose.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.